When their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness were over, Israel began to make its way toward Canaan to claim the land God had promised to the descendants of Abraham. They met resistance all along the way, but God gave them victory after victory over the forces that sought to stop them. By the time they reached the border of Moab, word of their successes had already reached Balak, the king of Moab. When Balak saw the number and strength of the Israelites arrayed against him, he became very fearful. So he sent word to Balaam the prophet and offered to pay him a handsome sum of money to call down a curse on Israel, which he believed would improve his chance of success on the battlefield. When Balaam arrived, he made his own survey of the tribes of Israel, and then went to a mountaintop to talk with the Lord. He had already told Balak that whether he cursed or blessed Israel, he could only say what the Lord told him to say. When Balaam came down from the mountain, what he told Balak is recorded in the book of Numbers, chapter 23, verse 23. Surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. According to this time it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought? So said the prophet Balaam concerning Israel's present and Israel's future. In league with the enemies of Israel, and fully committed to their cause, and soon to perish fighting sword in hand against the very people whose success he foretells, Balaam would have rejoiced if he could have discerned in the Hebrew nation the symptoms of political decay, or if he could have discovered in the heavens the gathering clouds of the divine displeasure. In vain does he ply his magic arts. In vain does he strain his eyes, looking north, south, east, and west for some omen of coming disaster. From every point of view which he occupies, from every quarter which he surveys, he beholds only the overwhelming assurance of Israel's complete success. Confounded and dismayed, he is constrained by the Spirit of God to utter against his wish the announcement of our text. To a similar declaration must the enemies of our nation be constrained. Those at home and abroad who have wished us ill and done us hurt have taken upon themselves the burden of Balaam, and like him have said, surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. According to this time it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel, what hath God wrought? It is to the question of the last clause of this verse that I would ask your attention, and it is indeed this question which I would attempt to answer today. Our enemies have asked this question in disappointed spite and defeated envy, but we may well repeat it in the spirit of thankful acknowledgement and devout reflection. Now, while every loyal heart throughout the country is still thrilling with joy unspeakable at the recent news of the fall of Richmond, treason's capital, now, while men draw their first long breath in 4 years, now when the burden of care and anxiety for ourselves and for our children is finally and forever lifted from off of us, now that we have exchanged the sickness of hope deferred for the well-nigh overwhelming certainty of complete and unexpected success, now with all humility and all worship, let us contemplate the great event of this war just past, and let us stretch our expectant hands into the future to gather up the results of this torrid conflict. Let us ask as thoughtful men, as patriots, as Christians, what hath God wrought? Bear with me while I affirm that in the midst of all our joy and all our congratulation, we do not yet appreciate the vast consequences of this great victory. When, on last Monday, the sentence, "Richmond has fallen," flashed along the telegraph wires from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, from the St. Lawrence to the Gulf, what did that sentence mean? It meant the power of the Confederacy was broken, says one. True, but it meant more than this. It meant the Civil War was virtually ended, answered another. True, but it meant more than this. It meant, says a third, it meant the Union, now and forever, one and indivisible. True, but it meant still more than this. These results, vast as they are, would not, in their statement, exhaustively answer the question of the text, what hath God wrought? The issues of the event of our Civil War are too wide, too high, and too beneficent to be circumscribed by the boundary lines of one land, one people, one age. They demand for their development all countries, all nations, all centuries. The flame that was kindled upon Richmond last Monday was the beacon light of hope to all the world. It is to these mightiest results I would now invite your attention, and in answer to the question, "What hath God wrought?" we would reply, in the overthrow of Richmond, the hand of God hath broken the chain of every slave throughout the earth. It is now more than 70 years since Jefferson, speaking the almost universal feeling of the statesman of his day, branded slavery as the sum of all villainies. It is more than 50 years since British courts rendered the decision which made it impossible for a slave to tread the soil of England. It is more than 30 years since by act of Parliament in all the colonies of the British Empire slavery was abolished, and the leading power of the world adjudged the slave trade as piracy. And yet, despite this array of adverse sentiment and adverse action, slave wars, slave trading, and slave holding still continued. How came it to pass, with all the great states of the older world unanimous in condemning it, that this abomination still existed, convulsing Africa from west to east with the throes of internecine strife, darkening the ocean with the black sails of the slavers, and riveting the shackles upon 10 millions of a harmless and inoffensive race? Was it because those second-rate powers of Spain and Portugal, with avarice hand, and still clutched their bondsmen and refused to let them go? No. The cause must always equal the effect. Two nations so weak and insignificant could never have continued against the sense of the civilized world. So gigantic a system of oppression had not a greater power sided with them. Let us place responsibility where it honestly belongs. It was because America, the youthful queen of the West, threw her recent but potent scepter onto the scale of oppression that the balance of the nations has hung poised for so long between slavery and freedom. It was owing to her open example and covert influence, to American capital, American vessels, to American seamen, American merchants, and American planters, that the slave ships still plowed the ocean and slave barracks still studied the coasts of Africa. But when Richmond fell, the Confederacy fell. And when the Confederacy fell, slavery fell, never again to rear its horrid head upon Anglo-Saxon soil. From that day onward, the example and influence of America are withdrawn from the cause of oppression, and the great powers of the earth become a single unit in opposing and crushing it. The weaker powers must simply follow suit. Spain, Portugal, Brazil, and the South American republics, overmastered by the overwhelming pressure of public opinion, must liberate their bondsmen. And he would be a bold man who should affirm that 10 years from now the flag of any Christian nation will float over a single slave. Africa, freed from these intestine conflicts which for 200 years slave-hunting expeditions have fomented and kept alive, may hope to staunch her bleeding wounds, and no longer crouching in terror at the feet of the nations, rise erect to the fullness of her stature, and to share with sister continents in the progress, the civilization, the Christianity of the age. Ethiopia shall yet stretch forth her free, unshackled hands to God. It is the Lord's doing, and it is wondrous in our eyes. Not unto us, but unto thy name give glory for thy mercy and for thy truth's sake. In answer to the question, what hath God wrought? We notice that in overthrowing Richmond, the hand of God hath pointed out republicanism as the one true and universal form of government for all the nations of the earth. The fall of the Confederacy ensures the stability of this popular representative government, and the perpetuation of this government ensures the downfall of every monarchy upon earth. The world is not wide enough for our great successful republic to stand side by side with despotisms, oligarchies, and monarchies. One must crowd out the other, not by force, but by conviction. All kinds of government, call them by what name you please, are divisible into two great classes. The first is that in which the governing power flows from the people, acting through their chosen representatives, in which, in truth, the governed are also the rulers. The second is that in which the power of making and administering the laws flows not from the people, but from royal prerogative, through family descent, and certain channels of privileged classes. Now, in theory at least, the first of these classes, the Republican representative form of government, has long since committed itself to the common sense of all thinking men. The superior advantages of such a system, as far as the theory went, were patently obvious to the first inspection. It was far more simple, progressive, flexible, equal, elevating, economical than any monarchy could possibly ever be. Here in a republic, there was no chance of the nation ever being cursed for a lifetime by the vices or weaknesses of an omnipotent ruler. Here in America, there was no opportunity for the 10th transmitter of a foolish face to burden the nation with taxation to carry out his inane whims. Here was no need of providing pensions to royal babies, nor for providing out of the coffers of the nation for the support of kingly bastards. Here was no need to furnish out of the hard earnings of the people cushy jobs for the relief of a decayed aristocracy. Here was no need of lavish, wasteful annual expenditures in order to awe and amuse the public with the show and tinsel of royalty. As far then as theory went, men long ago perceived that a republic in justice and economy surpassed any other form of government. But theory is not enough. Government is too practical a thing to be founded on anything short of practice. Could that theory then be carried out? Was such a form of government practicable? Who could tell? History, the instructor of the nations, was silent. From her pages of the last 18 centuries, she furnishes us with no example on a large scale to prove the feasibility of such an experiment. Wise politicians hesitated to launch the ship of state upon such a doubtful voyage of discovery, lest she should soon encounter the tempest of anarchy or go to pieces upon the rock of military despotism. And so they kept their respective nations moored fast in the docks of conservatism by the old-time anchors of kingly prerogative and class distinction. So they clung to their king and queens and princesses long after they had become the merest puppets at which the world ever looked and laughed. So they continued to bow before crowns and scepters and stars of nobility, while in their hearts they no more reverenced them than they did the gold-laced coats upon the backs of their footmen. To the mind of the student of history, a republic was a word of terrible import. A republic meant popular tumults, a Marius and a Sylla, a Julius Caesar, and a long line of despots. A republic meant civil war, and Oliver Cromwell, a Charles and James II. A republic meant a French Revolution, a reign of terror, and Napoleon I, and the second, and the third. No wonder then that European politicians shrank back from change. No wonder that they clung to the effete forms of government which bound the expanding life of the nations as with clamps of iron. But it was this American people's mission, under the leading of a kind, gracious, and omnipotent providence, to give to the word republic other meanings and other associations, to make that word the herald of hope to many a poor man ground down beneath the burden of class distinctions, to make that word the goal of effort to many a statesman striving for the elevation of his people. And when the old 13 states, at the call of God, set out upon the experiment of self-government, how universal among the politicians of Europe was their distrust of the result. How many were the prophecies of disaster? Now we were to fly to pieces from the want of a central coherent power. And now a republic was to be compressed into a despotism from the very excess of that power. Now we were too small to live, and now we were too great to continue. But despite all these auguries of misfortune, America still kept on her way, winning from forest and prairie, state after state, and offering for the taking a home for all the homeless of the world. And here again, in this fact of foreign immigration, envious politicians abroad and faint-hearted croakers at home perceived an omen of coming ruin. Our population, they told us, was too various, too conflicting, with too great differences of race and blood, ever to become one people or to dwell harmoniously under one government. But the lapse of time proved them mistaken. Years, as they rolled on, showed that there was some strange alchemy in American soil, transmuting all who trod it, whatever their faith or blood, into one people and one government. The Gaul, the Celt, the Norwegian, the Dane, the German, the Anglo-Saxon, side by side worked in our fields, voted in our polls, rallied around our flag, and poured out their blood in one mingled stream without stint or measure for one common country. One after another, by the stern logic of facts, these reasonings of bitter foes and timid friends were all refuted. The skepticism of the old world as to the success of the experiment of self-government in America was beginning to waver. Then, the booming of cannon in Charleston Harbor 4 years ago this very April announced that civil war was begun and revived the European skepticism with a vengeance. "I always told you so," cried the European politician. "The bubble has burst," declared the London Times, the great dictator of British political opinion. They were mistaken. It was not the bursting of the bubble which they witnessed, but the rendering of the chrysalis that the nation might rise to a higher, brighter, more expanded life. The sword of civil war was not, as they deemed it, the weapon of the executioner, having and quartering the body politic, and closing in ignominy the existence of a nation. No, it was rather the knife of the surgeon, cutting away by the very roots the foul cancer which had long fed upon our vitals, and thus restoring the people to a healthier and more vigorous life. And now that the patient has survived the operation, now that the pulses of the nation beat as never before with pure and untainted lifeblood, now that we have lived through and lived down a rebellion more gigantic than any Europe ever saw, now that we have raised for the defense of the Republic 1 million of soldiers and 2 billions of money without hiring one foreign mercenary or borrowing $1 saved from our own people, now after that, in the midst of all the bitter passions which civil war engenders, a national election has taken place, authorizing and confirming the acts of the executive without the semblance of riot or even tumult. After all this, who shall dare to question the possibility of national self-government? Who shall dare to affirm that popular sovereignty is only another name for lawless anarchy? Who will be bold enough or stupid enough to ask whether a pure republic is a possibility? Having admitted the theoretical excellence of a popular representative government, must not the statesmen and people of Europe confess also its practical superiority? Beholding America living through 4 long years of conflict, such as no monarchy in Europe could ever endure for a month without dismemberment, must not the most prejudiced mind be forced to admit that that government is the strongest which trusts most to the governed, and that it is only when and where the people rule that the executive can and will be sustained to the last drop of blood and the last dollar of treasure in the land? Is it not the lesson taught beyond the possibility of forgettal or mistake, that as a republic is the cheapest, freest, and most equal form of government, so also it is the strongest and the most stable? And what must follow upon the reception of this lesson but the endeavor to put it into practice? To use a homely illustration, suppose that into a neighboring town was introduced a mowing machine which the inhabitants of this town had never seen and had never tried. You might admire its theory, but you might question its practical efficiency, and so you might stand aloof from the novel invention. But if, season after season, you beheld the crops of the neighboring town harvested by this machine with a rapidity and certainty which the old-fashioned hand scythe could not equal, would you not, just as soon as you could, avail yourselves of all the advantages of the new implement? Now, government is a system of machinery for the accomplishment of certain ends, the peace, security, and well-being of society. And if one form is found to work out these results more certainly than another, the civilized nations of the earth will soon find it out. The people of those lands will demand in a tone that will preclude denial that their institutions be molded after the pattern of that which has thus proved itself successful and beneficent. And soon to follow, that select family party of kings and queens who now wield the scepters and absorb the revenues of Europe must accede to the demand for this better form of government or lose their thrones and perhaps their heads. It is only by gradual reform that they can buy off sudden and complete revolution. The young men of Europe will from this time forth study with enthusiasm the history and glory of America, and will resolve that an equal glory shall gild their own land. And if the princes and nobles stand in the way of that resolve, they will encounter the tempest of popular rage compared with which the discontent of 1848 was but a pattering of an April shower to the resistless sweep of a West India hurricane. If Washington had fallen on the 2nd of April instead of Richmond, if traitor hands had on that day forever torn in pieces the country's flag and eclipsed in the night of anarchy all its stars, then for another 1,000 years would the thrones of Europe have stood firm and solid. For another 1,000 years would the privileged class have ground the poor beneath their lordly heels. For another 1,000 years would labor have been defrauded and despised, and kingly blood and ancestral rank pampered and adored. For another 1,000 years, the broad lands of Europe's nobles, instead of feeding the starving poor, would have been, as at this day, parks for deer and preserves for partridge, that the lord might have his sport, although the peasant died of want. For another 1,000 years, with the soil of Britain as at this hour, instead of being divided among the 25 millions of hard-handed laborers, would have all been held and kept in the kid-gloved possession of a mere 30,000 privileged proprietors. In short, for another period of time, whose length no man can determine, would the people of Europe have been, as in ages past, only place markers on a board game in the hands of kings and queens and popes and princes, while they wore away the stupor of royalty by playing the game of politics. Again I say, if Washington had fallen on the 2nd of April instead of Richmond, the hands of the dial plate of human history would have been put back many centuries. The patriot and philanthropist in all lands would have abandoned as vain any further contest with kingly array and class arrogance. And poor men and all nations, with hopeless resignation, would bow their shoulders once and for all to the hereditary burden of ill-requited labor and unmerited oppression. Science, working for the few, not the many, would slacken in her mighty labors, and art, chained to the throne of kings, would grovel in the mire of flattery instead of soaring in the realms of truth. But what hath God wrought? It was Richmond fell, not Washington. And when Richmond fell, the hand of God wrote upon the wall of every kingly palace and lordly home throughout the world, "Thou art weighed in the balance of eternal justice and the people's needs, and art found wanting." The peal of military music with which our triumphant troops entered and dismantled the capital of slavery was the trump of the advancing future, proclaiming free government, free labor, free land, free speech, a free Bible, and a free church to all men everywhere. This hath God wrought. This will God accomplish. Oh, that man would praise the Lord for his goodness and for his wonderful works to the children of men. Yea, surely there is no enchantment against Jacob, neither is there any divination against Israel. According to this time it shall be said of Jacob and of Israel and of America, what hath God wrought? And we have answered
Freedom. Freedom. Freedom.